This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to journalist Ari Flanzraich. He's been on the ground covering the conflict, the new war between Israel and Palestine. He's going to be talking to us about the dire situation on the ground, explaining how and why this is happening now, and the various reactions to the war between Israelis and Palestinians. We will also be running an episode speaking to people directly on the ground in Gaza, but as you can imagine, it's quite difficult to make that call happen right now, considering they're under daily bombings. Support Popular Front at patreon.com/popularfront. So before we get into how this all started, well, it started a long time ago, but before this recent war started, tell me, how have you been? What have you been doing? You've been on the ground pretty much non-stop, working. Where have you been? What have you been doing?
So ever since things popped off, that was October 7th, so that was roughly 2 weeks ago. I've been basically rotating between the two borders. So I spent a good amount of time at the beginning on the Gazan border in what they call the Gazan envelope. So I visited in Kfar Aza, which is one of the sites of the massacre. I was interviewing IDF soldiers. I interviewed the commander who actually led the counterinsurgency. And his team, they were the ones who managed to basically take control after roughly 48 hours. And after that, as things began escalating in the north, I've been on the Lebanese border. So there's a small town called Shtula, which has been the site of quite a bit of anti-tank missiles. And this was also a big hotspot back in the 2006 war. I mean, at that time, there were lots of fears back then, even of Hezbollah infiltrations. And so in these villages and these border towns, you had, in many cases, tunnels that had already been penetrating some 60 meters into Israeli territory. And I guess the general sense is on the Gazan end, the original target was the original aim was to try to figure out what actually happened, because there's a whole lot of confusion over how this happened, what exactly happened, the extent of the damage and destruction, and how the IDF managed, or well, it took them quite a while to actually figure it out, but how they managed eventually to take control over the situation. Those conversations quickly turned into questions about, are they going to invade, and what does this ground invasion look like, as this will be the first ground invasion in just under a decade. Which is pretty serious. Since then, it's basically been, those 6 to 12 day rounds of fightings. Everyone gets what they want, and then they go back to the usual quiet. And as as talk of a ground invasion came up, then the Hezbollah threat, became front and center in Israeli news. And so that's basically what I've been doing. I've been trying to go back and forth, figuring out, what's happening and what are these borders going to look like if and when this becomes a multi-front confrontation.
They've been saying they're going to go for this ground invasion. Israel have been saying this. They're going to do the ground invasion into Gaza for about a week now. In the meantime, they have just been completely pummeling Gaza. I mean, frankly, indiscriminate attacks on civilians many, many, many times. Like so many children dead. What is it they're going to go into if they do this ground invasion? What exactly is going to be left?
I guess the quick answer is not a whole lot. And you're mentioning a lot of indiscriminate killing, and I have the numbers right in front of me. You have 4,000 Palestinians killed roughly as of now, and that's not accounting for however many hundreds, if not thousands, might be still under the rubble. Of those 4,000, 2,500 of them are women and children, and so you can basically assume that amidst all this talk amongst the IDF that they've been killing commanders, what we can really see is that at least 90% of all of the casualties are innocent civilians. And they don't have a whole lot to show, to be perfectly honest. We know that their main leadership, people like Yahya Sinwar, for example, who runs or heads the military wing of Gaza and reports directly to the upper echelons of Hamas based in Qatar, he's in a tunnel somewhere. No one actually knows where he is, and he's barely, much like Nasrallah, he's barely come out for the last several years. So basically what they've done is they began with eliminating a neighborhood called El Rimal, which was known to house many Hamas officials, but it was also just a generally upscale neighborhood in Gaza with tons of shops, tons of malls. They completely razed the entire place. And that was meant to be both an economic and a political hit to Hamas. They've tried to target the family members of anyone vaguely related to their, higher, officials. Um, to be honest, in the meantime, it doesn't look like they've done a whole lot. But what we do know is, as of the last week, there's been a massive effort, which began with them cutting off the water and electricity. There's been a massive effort to basically get up to 1.1 million Gazans to flee the entire northern half of the strip, and that would presumably be to make way for a full scale ground invasion. So basically it would be get everyone out of the northern part, destroy and raze everything completely, then get bulldozers in, move it out of the way, and then you can make way for your ground troops.
I was very briefly speaking to someone whose family were in Gaza, and as is with many people there, they weren't exactly on friendly terms with Hamas. They live in Gaza, but they don't like Hamas, as is with many people, despite what the media want to present it as. And this person was saying that basically their family were told by them, you don't go anywhere, or like you're in trouble because we need more people here. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I have, and I can tell you for a fact that that has happened. I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's a massive official Hamas operation trying to block people, because you have to also imagine that a lot of Hamas's leadership right now, they don't have the time to be spreading out checkpoints across Gaza. A lot of them are in hiding, and everyone's scrambling as they're getting bombarded day and night, 24 hours a day. But we do know for a fact that Hamas has been trying to prevent people from leaving their homes, because they know that that will be one of the only things that would theoretically stop Israel. I don't think it really would, as we can see. And there have also been talks of people trying to organize marches, so that right before the Israeli invasion, you might have whole like scores of Gazans swarming back to the northern portion of the strip. But I don't know how concrete all that is, and I have my doubts as to whether those numbers will be able. I mean, you're talking about a population of up to 1.1 million. So even if you got 50,000 of those people, it wouldn't put a big dent in Israel's plans.
That's a good point. Also, it's kind of irrelevant in my opinion. Like, well, do they support them? Okay, then their kids should die. That's just like at least how British media is presenting this right now, which is fucking crazy. But we should probably go back to how this new war started. So, for anybody that's kind of not fully engaged with it, not remembering it, didn't really pay attention, maybe you can just go into how this new round started. And I just want to say as well to the listeners, we are planning to do a full on interview with someone currently in Gaza, but as you can probably imagine, it's very difficult for communications. But yeah, Ari, if you can please just, how did this start?
I'll give you the broader answer very briefly, and then we can zero in on the actual event. So I recall in our last conversation, which must have been in May, we were talking about the recent round of fighting between Islamic Jihad and Israel. And the main question, or the main topic, was basically what broke the dam? When did the dam break? And the answer is in 2021, as you know. And that was the first time the West Bank popped off. Hamas, after a long silence, began bombarding Israel. They sort of came back, they jumped back into the scene. And it was the first time the West Bank people were firing on Israeli troops. And to everyone's surprise, even the Arab Israeli population, some 2 million people comprising 20% of the Israeli population, rose up, mainly in mixed cities. And it was the first, we can say it was basically, something snapped, a dam broke. And since then, as of October 2022, what we found is that Hamas mended ties with Islamic Jihad, and they were traditionally rivals. And it seems to me as though Hamas understood that if they don't jump on the Iranian gravy train, which means making peace with Islamic Jihad, mending ties with the Shia axis, and starting to meet with Nasrallah, that in another 10 years they're going to find themselves obsolete, which means they're not going to have money and they're not going to have territory, and they'll eventually wither. And so, as of October or November 2022, what we see is a whole round of rapprochements, basically. So, Islamic Jihad and Hamas get together. They announce the formation or the restoration of this joint room, which basically means like all these factions, we're back in business with each other. And then within a month, they're meeting. Hamas is in Moscow. Hamas is then mending ties with Syria. They're then meeting with Nasrallah. They're invited to Iran for a meeting with the leader. And since then, what we've seen is that on a near, I'd say bi-weekly, if not monthly basis, Islamic Jihad, Hamas are sitting in Beirut, somewhere in the Dahiya, in Nasrallah's bunker, and I can guarantee you they're not talking about cake. So that's the sort of broader picture. And if we want to zero in on this event, I think we should go back about a month ago. So as you know, I don't know if you heard. So usually when Hamas wants something, they launch these balloon campaigns. They call them the marches, the return marches or marches of return. And it's basically when a bunch of Gazans congregate on the border. The ambulances and the tents are all ready for casualties. The Israelis line up on their side with snipers, and it's basically them sending incendiary balloons over the border in an attempt to burn agricultural lands in the Gazan envelope, those Israeli towns along the border. And, maybe once or twice a day, someone will try to take a shot at an Israeli soldier or explode or use some IED, some pretty poorly made IED. And I remember about 3 to 4 weeks ago, it must have been 4 weeks ago now, I was sitting with a friend and he asked me why I think they're doing it. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why they were doing it because usually they want building materials, they want work permits for Gazans, which brings a lot of money into their economy. And it was really unclear as to what they were doing. And eventually it ended. And the Israelis were given the sense that, we had a bit of a flare up and now things are quiet. And then 2 weeks later, which is 1 week before the October 7th massacre, Islamic Jihad decided to run a military exercise in Gaza, in which they actually practiced this parachuting, as you can see on videos. And usually they tend to run these exercises sort of deeper into the strip, but in this case, they ran the exercise so close to the Israeli border that it set off air raid sirens or bomb alarms in the Gazan envelope. And in retrospect, what we understand is that this might well have been an attempt to lull the Israelis into a kind of complacency and to give them this false sense of, things flared up. We shot some rockets, we threw some balloons, and now you can expect a bit of quiet. And that brings us up to the morning of October 7th. I was actually up that night. I was at a wedding and I didn't sleep the entire night. And at about 6:29, I went to, throw my head on my pillow, and I did a brief scan of Telegram before, and suddenly I saw a red alert. I go outside, shirtless, and I walk into the middle of the street outside of Tel Aviv, and bombs are going off. Everyone's still sleeping, and it was entirely unclear what was going on. The entire country was taken by surprise. And I remember thinking that this is either a rogue group that decide, occasionally you have a group that goes rogue and then Hamas comes out and says, no, no, it wasn't us. Or you have the start of something very concerning. And within 30 minutes on Arabic language Telegram channels, you saw the word tasallul, which in Arabic means infiltration. And from that point onward, you basically got photos of the parachutes, and then you had Hamas guys running around Israeli towns. And what happened was basically they staged multiple incursions penetrating the fences. And we can estimate that at the beginning, at least 100 militants had come in, potentially more. And they struck a few different military bases on the border. They used drones to eliminate their comms. You can see a video of them, dropping an explosive device on a satellite. And the soldiers at that point were all sleeping, so they walked into many of their rooms and massacred, large swaths of soldiers, sometimes 10 at a time. And from there on, they proceeded to enter and penetrate something like 10 to 12 Israeli towns, kibbutzim, you call them in Hebrew, along the border. And I think we all know what happened after that. And what the interesting point is that once that dam broke, Gazans, you see in the videos that there were tons of militants that came in, but behind them there were a ton of regular Gazan civilians who trailed in behind them. And they then brought a tractor and opened up a bigger hole in the fence. And for the better portion of at least 24 hours, I would say, there was just this open highway between the Gazan envelope, these Israeli towns, and Gaza proper.
And some of these areas were settler areas, right?
The Palestinian word for them are mustotanin, which is settlers, but this is Israel proper. Those don't count as settlements. They're not illegal settlements, but of course the Palestinians consider anything on Israel proper Israeli land to be settlements, to be land that was taken and conquered and stolen.
Right. And so Hamas went in with this incredibly well planned attack. Many civilians just killed, paraded around, women stripped. There's the video of the girl in the back of the truck. People are literally taking turns to spit on her head as she's driven around. She was at this music festival, right? I believe like something like over 200 people were killed there. Is that correct?
I think it might have been more, and in many cases, we still don't actually have a final number. I think there's as many as 200 people that haven't been accounted for.
And they were just at a party, right?
It was what you call in Hebrew msibat teva, which is like a nature party, and it's sort of like it's sort of like a festival. Like there's many different stages, and there was up to I think 1,000. There might have been more than 1,000 people there, and they're often held in like sort of naturey pastoral areas of Israel, and it was right along the Gazan border, which in my opinion was actually rather foolish. And I don't know if they knew this was going to happen, but it would have been obvious as they were preparing that there were lights and music coming from this part of and Be'eri, the site of the massacre, the festival massacre, was part of their plan. And so I think this was something they tacked on um, as they were as this operation unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, I understand there's a difference between, right, here's a rebelling force, whatever anybody thinks about them, whatever, just that removed. Here's a rebelling force, they're going to fight this group. But this is a straight up massacre to go and kill like hundreds of people at a party, all unarmed. And also, elderly people just waiting for the bus was shot dead in the streets. Your average kind of like persistently online white communists would say, well, that's just collateral damage, but there was no soldiers near those elderly people that were just shot dead randomly like that. But there was also soldiers involved in this, right? So there was outposts were overrun. I believe like a base was stormed by Hamas. What about that side of it?
So there were multiple bases because along the Israeli border you have multiple different checkpoints and bases, and several of them were stormed by Israeli forces. They blew up numerous jeeps. They blew up tanks. In one case, there was actually they blew up a tank that was sitting on the border, and they pulled out several bodies. I think it was three. One of them was alive, and the other two were dead. Um, and to speak to, so they penetrated these borders. They went in, and what ensued was just a huge massacre. And I think it's important to note that afterwards, when the IDF finally cleared the area, first of all, they took and collected all of the munitions that Hamas brought in, and they put it in a room. And there's a photograph, and you're looking at an obscene amount of firepower. An amount of firepower that would leave anyone convinced that they were expecting this to succeed, which is contrary to many people's opinions. People's opinions are such that many people guessed that Hamas only intended to raid these bases, and then it just went so well that they couldn't stop themselves. But there's two things or three things that indicate that that wasn't the case. The first thing is the amount of firepower that was brought in. The second thing is the amount of first aid and food that the militants had brought with them, suggesting that they were planning to stay for quite some time. And the most important indication is an operational playbook that was actually found in one of the pickups. Um, and it basically, they released 4 out of 14 pages, and it shows that they had been planning this for a year. The document is dated October 2022, which, by the way, is exactly when this whole rapprochement with the Shia axis and with Hezbollah began. And it shows that they had everything down to the number of civilians, the number of residents, the IDF response times. All of this was noted. And so this was a very well planned operation, and they were at least expecting for this to carry on for quite some time.
Hmm. So this would have been planned months and months in advance. How did Israel not clock what was going on? I mean, it's kind of projected often in the media as if like Mossad, Israel, nowhere to hide, we see you everywhere, this kind of thing. Well, clearly that wasn't the case for this. What happened?
This is the golden question. And I'd preface it with a few comments, an interview that came out 3 months ago. So this is about 2.5 months before the massacre. And there's a guy named General Yitzhak Brick. He's a pretty well-known IDF general, and he has been in the army for some maybe 60 years, several decades. And sometime over the last few years, he was tasked by the IDF with running an internal audit of the IDF, which meant that for a period of maybe a month or two, if not more, he rotated between every front, from the West Bank to the Gaza envelope to the Egyptian border, all the way through to Lebanon. Basically trying to get a sense of, like, are we ready? What is our preparedness as an army? And he came to the conclusion and released a report to this effect that the IDF, well, we had been given the impression that they had, over the course of this 9-year silence, thrusted themselves 50 years into the future, technologically and tactically and operationally, logistically. In fact, it became evident that they'd gone 30 years back, that they'd regressed. And he noted things like the rusty trucks, no one had night vision goggles at posts, outposts were poorly protected, they had cut 50% of many troop squadrons, such that you had, what should have been an 8-person unit wound up being a 4-person unit. And while those 8 people were meant to cover maybe 8 kilometers, you had less people, or half the people, covering double the territory. And he came to the conclusion, and he says it in an interview, that a massacre is going to happen here. Those are his words. And this brings us to the next question, which is, how in the world did Hamas manage to penetrate what was meant to be one of the most secure borders, both above and underground, in the world? And what we see is, well, first and foremost, we know there's at least pretty solid rumors, reports that the Egyptians had notified Israel that there was suspicious activity and that something was brewing. The Americans apparently notified Israel. And Tzachi Hanegbi, the chief of Homeland Security, as you'd call it in Israel, he actually admitted last week that 2 hours before this happened, so at roughly 4:30 in the morning, intelligence officials or Israeli security officials had come to the border, and they had determined that everything was fine. There was nothing unusual happening. And now, as of the last few days, there's been interviews with what you'd call people who man the observation posts, so regular soldiers. And there's one girl who was recorded saying that, I saw people walking around with maps in the days leading up to the attack. I reported it and I was laughed at.
Right. So why was no one paying attention? This doesn't make sense to me.
Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And the Israelis have, as of the last 2 weeks, they've come up with a very convenient line, which is, right now we're at war. And we're not going to talk about this. This is no time to cast doubts upon the security establishment. We're not perfect. A real mistake happened, and this will all be investigated thoroughly once this is all over. And the Israelis somehow seem satisfied with that answer. I know this has basically ceased to appear on main headlines.
Popular Front is entirely grassroots and independent. Subscribe to our Patreon for hundreds of exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, and much more. It keeps us moving forward, and you get lots of exclusive content. Subscribe at patreon.com/popularfront. Really? So even the news is just like, that's okay, forget about it.
Basically, I mean, they're just saying, this isn't the time. We're at war. This isn't a time for internal disputes, and they're always hearkening back. They're referencing the whole judicial reform schism that took place. Like, they're saying, they're basically suggesting or gesturing at this schism that happened right before weakened us internally, and we don't have time for another schism.
Well, yeah, we could speculate on that all day, but I won't. Something I think we have to talk about now is the kind of reaction on the Israel side. Now, obviously, I understand Hamas come over, killing lots of civilians, horrible, footage coming out, and then now Gaza is under its own massacre as well from the other side, and so, like, it's 2 massacres don't make a right, if you ask me. But it seems now that the whole world, not the whole world, but a lot of the world, especially my clown country that I'm from, is kind of not even condemning anymore the fact that the majority of people dying in Gaza now are civilians. Babies are being killed literally daily. And everyone's just kind of like, well, Hamas shouldn't have done that. It's like, okay, well, 2 things can be bad. I really cannot believe the callousness that I've seen in even mainstream kind of legacy press over here, and also extreme levels of censorship internally to always present things in the favor of Israel, which is not a conspiracy. It is happening. I've heard from people at very big newspapers that this is happening. And it's just got very odd. But I would like to know, what is the perspective from the ground there? You've been on the Israeli side, obviously you can't get into Gaza, but what's the perspective from like soldiers, that kind of thing? Do they, I imagine they don't give a shit, but like I just think it would be interesting to know, locally, what's the idea? Is it, fuck it, we just have to kill everybody, it doesn't matter? Or are they trying to make excuses? No, we're not actually, what's going on?
That's a great question. And I've been interviewing a ton of soldiers, and the one word that's continuously brought up is revenge. And I think people are forgetting that we have not seen, despite all the crimes committed in the West Bank and all the brutality that we see on a daily basis, we have not yet seen an IDF that is basically overcome with revenge. And that's a very dangerous prospect. And what we're seeing is, I was on the border about a week ago, and I spoke to a soldier, a reservist, who's actually a settler as well. And he said the following. I told him, I said, what are we going to do? What's going to happen now? You have one front, you might have another front. How does this end? And he says, I'll be totally honest with you. What we really got to do is we got to finish them off quickly. He said, we have to go in, we have to flatten Gaza, we have to send all of them running to the sea. Whoever we don't kill, we have to send them running to the sea. And he was basically promoting the notion of a large scale massacre. And the caveat was that he said, we're not murderers, but this is just something we have to do. And I heard this comment over and over again. I heard it the other day also on the northern, deep in the northern front, in a place called Kiryat Shmona, where a guy told me we have to turn Gaza into a parking lot. And this is something, and you can say that these are isolated cases or individual soldiers, but basically the same, or at least a synonymous narrative, is being propagated by the Israeli government and the mainstream media. It's now an accepted line to say we have to wipe them out, and we can no longer discriminate between civilian and soldier, because they did the same thing to us. And so it brings me back to the main point, which is that Israel now has a license to kill, the likes of which they haven't had perhaps ever. And that's a very dangerous prospect.
That is a very dangerous prospect. And I just cannot get my head around people genuinely barefaced saying, yeah, democratic Western values, was then being like, ban pro-Palestine protests. It's okay when babies and children are killed because the Hamas did something awful. I just can't get my head around it. I mean, maybe I'm being naive. I've been doing this 10 years now, but this seems so vicious at this thing. Like, how is it the little baby's fault? You know what I'm saying? I guess it's not. I don't know. I guess there's no point even going on about it. We know how it is, but it just seems like there's going to be no attempt at anything until literally Gaza's going to be uninhabitable. That's the mission plan, right?
So the objectives. This just came out as the last few days, and I think it's a very interesting point, and it might, let us segue into either the West Bank or Lebanon, which is, as of in recent days, the Israelis basically have said, or they formalized a plan, and it is to go in, to destroy all of Hamas's infrastructure, which includes their tunnel systems, which been developing for 10 years now. So you can only imagine how sophisticated they are. And to replace Hamas with, quote, this is the quote, which is very vague, dangerously vague. We're going to replace Hamas with a new security regime. And just to go back to your point where you say, how is it possible that people are ignoring what's happening in Gaza, and the fact that obviously 2 million Gazans did not have anything to do with a mission that was kept secret for at least a year. And it's that the Israelis and the Western world has the sense that this all came out of a vacuum. I mean, people have basically just ignored, which is not to justify what happened. What happened is absolutely horrendous, and must be denounced,
Without a doubt,
which
yes.
must be denounced. Um, but on the other hand, it didn't happen out of nowhere. And I think the West is inclined to just see this as people who one day woke up, popped out of their house, and decided they're going to butcher 1,000 to 1,500 Jews. Um, and that's not exactly the case. And beyond that, Hamas has to a large extent been propped up by the Israelis. Between 2005 and 2007, when the PA had control after Israel's withdrawal of Gaza, Israel knew that Hamas existed there. And Israel knew that Gaza was Hamas's stronghold. And my sense is that they allowed them to exist in order to create some schism within the Gazan population. Better that they fight each other than unite against us. And then one day they woke up and PA officials were being thrown off roofs. And ever since then, Hamas has been the convenient enemy of Israel. Throw a few punches, take a few punches. They get to say they're nitty gritty resistance fighters, and we get to say that we're protecting our security or safeguarding our security.
I think that's a good point, but it's funny because up until this war, that would be, very legitimate thing to say. No one would question it. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. Like it's kind of, even, pro-Israeli writers have said such things. But now everything's been turned on its head. Just us having this conversation will no doubt be called everything you can think of. And it's very weird, like the media landscape. I don't want to go on about it too much because it's, there's nothing more annoying than journalists talking about journalism. But the media landscape very, very quickly got very dark. And I actually never seen it this level. As a reporter working out there, how are you finding it?
I can't speak too much to my reporting because, as you know, I'm reporting with a publication, and I don't want to speak out of line. But what I can definitely tell you is that it's very difficult because ultimately the bigger outlets have an agenda, and they're also working within Israel, which means that they're working with IDF spokespeople, and they're looking at every single article you put out. And it's gotten to the point where, in certain cases, they've come to us asking, "Where did you get this line? We want to make sure that this line is actually real." Al Jazeera was recently kicked out of Israel, I believe, or in the meantime, they've been prevented from filming and reporting. It's it's definitely difficult because Israel obviously doesn't want anyone to get in the way of what they see as their get out of jail free card. Um, yeah, I don't really know what to say on that. It's always been difficult, but it's very difficult right now. Um, and my sense is that the Western outlets definitely prioritize the Israeli side, because I don't see a whole lot of talk about Palestinian deaths or even individual stories that are zeroing in and focusing exclusively on the conditions or the circumstances the last year, the last 2 years. It's all, as I said, it's the vacuum. The reporting begins on October 7th.
Right, that's the issue, and we don't need to go over it again. We've actually done many reports on the various histories and whatever, but it feels very strange to be literally kind of frowned at as a reporter, to be like, hey, I think it's really bad that babies are being indiscriminately killed, and for someone to be like, well, what about the Hamas massacre? Like, yeah, that was really fucking bad, and so is killing babies. And it's like, oh god, oh, and it's like, I cannot believe that is like even kind of an acceptable way to be. I've just never seen people so callously just cast aside the idea that children's brains are being blown to pieces, and well, that's okay because something really bad happened 2 weeks ago. And it's like we're meant to relay information. And surely, if you're a war reporter, when civilians are being killed, you should really focus on that now. I don't know. It's. I don't want to go on about it. It's depressing, but and we've been getting called everything. We don't really give a shit. Like, whatever. You just move past it and ignore it. But it is strange to think that that's probably going to have a big problem when we actually want to head over and report there for a documentary. It's just like, just going, hey, this is bad, like, or even just not even saying that, going like, here's what happened, is enough to be like, well, you're out, you're not in the group, whichever side as well. People are very angry from all directions at us, just going, hey, this happened. But anyway, let's talk about the West Bank. What's happening in the rest of Palestine right now?
So the West Bank has been, as you probably know, relatively quiet. It's a bit of a curious quiet in the West Bank. What we do know is that up until this point, from October 7th up until now, you have 1,000 arrests in the West Bank. And basically, as far as I understand, there's massive Hamas roundups. Anyone related, however loosely, to Hamas is being rounded up. And there's roughly 80 to 90 people who have been killed in the West Bank, which is, it's a noteworthy number. It's quite a bit of death. And places like Hawara, which is right outside of Nablus, has been the site of numerous terrorist attacks, is under complete siege. And Tulkarem and Jenin have also, they've had some clashes. The IDF has been raiding Tulkarem quite a bit lately. And there's also been scattered clashes between Jenin factions and the IDF. But by and large, the situation seems to be contained. And I think there is at least one question in there, which is, I mean, is it the PA or is it the IDF? Or is there coordination between the two? And what we know is that these 1,000 arrests are not being done by the PA, despite the fact that in the months leading up to this attack, this massacre, the PA was actually rounding up tons of people. As of the last Jenin operation, the PA began to take greater control, and began to exhibit a degree of like, we're making a comeback now, as if the Israelis had opened up a space for them to operate. And this came alongside talks of weapons having been brought to the PA via Jordan and America. It came alongside talks of Saudi normalization, which would have had to include Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. And I think we can assume that right now there are backroom talks between Jordan, Egypt, the US, and Israel and the PA about bolstering the PA and giving them a lot of incentive to keep things quiet. And I think it probably goes something like this: you guys keep the West Bank quiet because we cannot afford to have ourselves spread thin. And we can also not afford to have our scattered settlements overrun by thousands, well, up to 3 million Palestinians. It's a massive security risk, and the number of settlers actually in the West Bank are lower than what people think. You have maybe 7 to 800,000 settlers, but a lot of the biggest settlements, Ma'ale Adumim, which is like 120,000 people, um, it's right on the border. A lot of the big ones straddle the border, such that they might be facing the West Bank, but their backs are to Israel, which means if things ever pop off, people are just going to turn around and flee inward. And so what you have actually is not 3 million Palestinians against 700 or 800,000. What you have is 3 million Palestinians against maybe 200,000. And those aren't exact numbers, but it gives you a sense of how big the security risk is in the West Bank. And that's in addition to the fact that some 60, I believe 60 to 70% of Israel's active army is generally operating in the West Bank. And so the question is, what happens when two other fronts open up? And the last point I'll make, going back to the PA, is that we can't forget that the PA back in the day, they had Gaza, and they have since been, um, they've since been rivals. The rivalry between Hamas and the PA has never ended. And there's a lot of talk. I mentioned one of the objectives of the Israelis now is to implement a new security regime. No one knows how that's going to happen, but I can tell you that the Israelis are not going to take administrative control of the Gaza Strip again, because it's an economic and tactical nightmare. And the only viable option seems to be the PA. And so, behind closed doors, I wouldn't be surprised, and I know many journalists, Palestinian journalists as well, who are convinced that the PA is being courted.
That's a really good point I hadn't even thought about. Yeah, that sounds exactly right. What a what a bad situation for the Palestinians looking for some solidarity anywhere. The Hezbollah have been like really active as well on the border, right? And they've been saying a lot online, like they're gonna go in, they're gonna go in. I don't believe they actually have yet. You were reporting near there, right? Can you give us some idea what's going on with the Hezbollah front?
Yeah. So as we said, over the last year, Hamas and Islamic Jihad have been meeting on a regular basis with Hezbollah. And it came to the point where I think they thought the relations were comfy enough or secure enough that Hezbollah actually declared that they'd given Hamas free reign to operate in southern Lebanon, which is a very interesting development that happened a few months back. And what we've seen since October 7th is, first of all, Hassan Nasrallah hasn't spoken, which is very rare. Usually, Hassan Nasrallah, the moment something happens, he comes out and he speaks, but he's kept his silence. And I know many analysts who are saying that there's nothing worse than a silent Nasrallah. And so, over the last week, especially, you have several escalations on the northern border. You have I'd say something between 10 and 20 IDF soldiers have been killed. Hezbollah they've also begun to count corpses over the last few weeks. And you've had a lot of anti-tank missile fire, exchanges of light gunfire and anti-tank missiles across the border, and it seems to be that everyone's trying to maintain some degree of composure. No one wants to, as they say in Hebrew, break the dishes. But there's a few things we should probably know, which is there's also been two rocket barrages, but interestingly, Hamas has taken responsibility for those rocket barrages, even though they were done, they were executed on Hezbollah territory, which means they got full permission from Hezbollah. But it allowed Hezbollah to evade accountability, and it allowed Israel to basically keep themselves composed. Because if Hezbollah comes out and starts barraging northern Israel, Israel will have to respond. Um, so there's a few things we should know, which is what happened in the south, which is an infiltration, a large scale infiltration, an occupation of Israeli border towns. That has been the main fear of northern residents for many years now. The people in the south never had that fear. The people in the south understood that there's a big barrier. There's tons of monitoring systems. You got cameras, you got sensors, you have an underground barrier. They assumed that they were fine, but the northern border has always been overcome by this kind of fear that any day they can come in, and Hezbollah has made that clear. They have a force. So all in all, they're estimated to have 50,000 soldiers, and of those 50,000 they have 8,000 to 100, which is called Redwan, and these are their elite forces, and they have the best equipment, they have the best training, and these are guys who have also been battle worn. Like they've been operating in Syria for upwards of a decade, while Israeli soldiers have been running around chasing kids with pocket knives in the West Bank.
Right. That's something I was really thinking about. Like in terms of okay, now you're fighting a force like this, it's a lot different to, various skirmishes on the border or inside the West Bank. This is completely different. Like you said, Hezbollah, they're very battle hardened now. Like you said, they've been fighting on the side of Assad for like a long time now, like a decade.
And they also, Hezbollah runs, first of all, they have unlimited access to weapons. In order for Hamas to get weapons, they have tunnels under the Rafah border. They have to like smuggle stuff and bribe people, and it can't be in large quantities. It's a huge mess. But Hezbollah, they have tunnel systems running from, I believe, the Syrian side into Lebanon, and they just have free flowing. It's just a train of weapons coming in all the time. And the numbers tell us that, over the course of 51 days in 2006, Hezbollah reportedly fired 3,790 rockets. They're now estimated to be able to fire anywhere between 4 to 6,000 a day.
Why then is Iron Dome not deflecting all of these? Now I know that the perception of Iron Dome is that it's like ironclad, like no one can get in. But it from the outside looking in, it seems like a lot got in. But I know from when we were speaking, you said it's not quite that, right?
Yeah, so in terms of the first few days, when October 7th to 10th, when you had quite a few bombs that direct hits, that was probably because usually we have some sort of prelude to flare-ups. So Israel usually has like a week where they can get their troops ready and they position their iron domes, they make sure there's enough stock, but they weren't ready. They were caught with their pants down. And so I think that's one reason why it might have been less effective. And the fears in the north is basically that Hezbollah has the ability to fire huge amounts of rockets in a concentrated area, such that they could probably overwhelm the Iron Dome in some cases.
Interesting. What do you think's going to go on with Iran? I know they're saying a lot, they're talking a lot. Do you think they're actually going to get properly involved, or they're just going to run it all through Hezbollah? Like, I can't see them actually personally, like really digging in, but I don't know as much as you.
I highly doubt it. I mean, the Iranians are, they're wimps. If we're gonna put it straight, like they're pretty wimpy.
You're on a hit list right now.
Yep, definitely. They're wimps, I think, and I think you can see as much in the way they manage their proxies across the Middle East. Right, Hezbollah basically is the middleman between Iran and all of their operations. The Iranians have commanders, and they have sort of top guys who are going out mapping out the strategy, but the people who do the work are Hezbollah, and then they have all kinds of Afghani, Pakistani, and they have the Houthis in Yemen. But Iran tries to keep themselves at a distance, and I think we know why. And it's probably because um, their interior is pretty fragile. I don't know if Iran could handle, a massive rocket barrage and troops, or maybe an American air raid. I think that would be a lot because there's a lot of elements in Iranian society that will be ready to jump on any opportunity. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're right, and we've already seen it in Iraq as well. Like Iran-affiliated groups, Hashd al-Shabi, they were already doing stuff like they bombed an American position. Some reports that some soldiers actually died, but I don't know if that's true. I haven't looked at it properly. And yeah, I just see it happening like that. But what I do think is when this is all over, it won't be over for Iran. I can just see Israel being like, right, now we get them. However that works out, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure that the Americans will be quite instrumental in that as well.
And that's probably the reason why they're being so explicitly supportive. Like I think Biden making a wartime visit, that's probably the first time an American president has ever made such a visit in the history of Israel. And I think yeah, that's what I've seen, and I think it has a lot less to do with their love of Israel. I think this is a huge strategic move because they know that Israel's basically their last hope in the Middle East. And in a way, Israel, much like Hamas for Iran or Hezbollah for Iran, they're also to some extent doing America's dirty work. The Americans are like, we're going to give you whatever you want, and you're going to put your necks on the line because that's what we need. Because we don't want to get sucked back into Iraq or Afghanistan, right? So I think that's a pretty important point. Um, and I think we're also forgetting, and in terms of the pace of all this, because you mentioned earlier on that, everyone, I've seen a lot of people talking now, and they're saying after 1 or 2 weeks, they're like, are they even going to invade Gaza? Is Hezbollah even going to, infiltrate? And I think the silence is very misleading. And I think we also have to remember that we're now on a different clock. Just as we're now in a new era, we're also, with that new era comes a new clock. And no one's rushing. Hezbollah knows they have time. And you can see that they're moving huge amounts of forces from West Syria, which is Deir ez-Zor, which is usually the American hotspot, right, where they have their bases. And they're moving huge amounts of forces to South Damascus and the Golan border, and that could be anywhere. That could be up to 100,000 people. The Houthis 2 days ago fired rockets across the Red Sea. That's where Iran has some of their biggest missile factories, and basically a national militia ready to die for them.
Yeah, that was crazy. They had a huge protest there as well.
Yeah, they got it some crazy. That was probably the biggest protest in the entire Middle East. I mean, it was crazier there than in Jordan, which is basically, I think, 50-60% Palestinian. And so I think the conclusion we can draw is that it's far from over. And I think at the very least, and the last point being that why would Hamas, which is, they might be terrorists and they might be butchers, but they're a rational organization. They've run they've basically run a puppet state for the better part of almost 2 decades. They have a leadership that lives it up. They're living in luxury in Qatar and in Turkey. They're on private jets. They're eating nice food. Why would they commit suicide if they weren't given guarantees by Hezbollah that at some point they're going to open up the second front and bail them out? That's a question that's the question that's been lingering for me.
I think at the same time, though, those kind of alliances can change in seconds.
Yeah, and the other one of the possibilities is that Hezbollah is going to say, you know what, this isn't worth it, and we're going to feed you to the wolves, and that might well happen.
It's been quite funny. One of our guys was like reading the like telegrams, one of the like pro Hezbollah ones, and like loads of the comments were just like in Arabic, just like, "Why haven't you gone in yet, you fucking pussies?" Like, which was quite interesting to see. But yeah, maybe I think you're right that this isn't going to be over quick. Like, definitely not.
And we're not going to know anything until the ground invasion happens, because I think the whole point is that they want Israel to get bogged down. They want to see how they behave, how they operate in Gaza, and they're also hoping that the West Bank pops off. They want to spread them as thin as they can before moving a finger.
Yeah, I think you're right. Um, Last thing I just want to ask, what about aid? How is aid for people in Gaza? Obviously, they shut off the electric, they shut off the water. which I think is an international war crime, but my country was like, oh, cool, because that's, yeah, honestly, it's just fucking embarrassing. Yeah, what's the situation now? Like trying to get aid or anything in there? How are Palestinians even living at this point in Gaza?
It's not looking great. I know, I'm almost certain, to be honest, I have to admit, I haven't followed this as much as I can. I've been on the move and sort of roaming around in the fields quite a bit. But what I do know is that two hostages were released last night. I'm pretty sure that aid is either on the border or has actually been brought into Gaza. Do you know if the aid has actually been brought in, or is it still waiting on the border?
I don't know. I heard that one of the routes was bombed recently, so
Yeah.
then it was ready to go and then it couldn't go.
There were a lot. I know for a fact that it was bombed once. There was also rumors about a day or two ago that they bombed the same route after they repaired it for the second time, and that the Israelis had a ton of concerns that Hamas would use this to have things smuggled. They didn't want the Egyptians checking the aid supplies. They wanted to make sure that, I think they wanted to keep half of the aid until they could be certain that the aid got to the people, innocent civilians who need it. Um, as for the water, I mean, you got to give them credit. They did turn the water back on in half of Gaza, only in the south.
Having turned it
Well,
off.
they turned off all the water, and people were like, "Well, we don't have water." And then they're like, "You know what? We're going to give you water in the south, so maybe you should go there." And that was, obviously creating incentive to expedite this evacuation. Um, but the situation isn't great. I know that hospitals are, while also under threat of bombing. Israel has notified numerous hospitals that they're going to bomb them. And they've told hospitals where you have a combination of like dying patients and their families and civilians looking to take cover, and they're like, you have like a day to get everyone out, and they're just like, we can't, like that just can't happen. Um, the situation is dire, and I don't see it getting much better. But I think they're going to have to get all of their aid before Israel stages this ground invasion, and I think this will be what allows for more progress on hostage exchanges. Um, Hamas is looking for some kind of lull before the invasion, and I think the aid and the hostage, this whole saga, will be at the center of that lull. But I might be wrong.
All right, bro. Well, we'll speak again soon. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this, and stay cautious out there. I think you're one of the most level-headed reporters out there as well. But don't worry, we'll both get called everything under the sun for this, but it's okay. Stay cautious out there, man, and I hope things work out.
Take it easy. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, man. If people want to follow your work, where can they do that? Direct them.
Ari, Ari Flanzraich, Flanzraich, I guess Instagram.
That the best way, yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, mate, cool. All right, man, speak soon.
Take it easy.
That was the Popular Front podcast. If you want more exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, subscribe to patreon.com/popularfront. We're entirely independent and grassroots. Nobody owns us. Patreon keeps us going, as does our merchandise. You can get Popular Front clothes and accessories at www.popularfront.shop. You can also buy our various publications there, like the Popular Front magazine. We are censored on social media and streaming platforms, so please follow us and share our content. Watch our documentaries at youtube.com/popularfront. Follow us on Instagram at popular.front, on Twitter at popularfront_, and for uncensored updates on the world at war, follow our Telegram at popularxfront or t.me/popularxfront. If you want to keep track of my work, it's the same on all socials at Jake_Hanrahan. That's HANRAHAN. For all these links and more, go to www.popularfront.cc. The music in this episode was produced by Sam Black. Check him out at samblackpf.com or search Sam Black PF on Spotify. The intro music is by Home. Thank you to our sponsors, This episode was sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use a promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. The episode was also sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 South West Bond Avenue, 97239. If you want to advertise with us, email jake@hanrahan.tv. Thank you to the credit tier Patreons. They are Pengu, Jessica, Peter Cherry, Lupe Calderon Garnica, Cyril Geist, Thomas Giuseppe, Jake Fuentes, Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvin, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R, Justin Katuna, Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Benjamin Tupper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Damien, Cameron Collins, Matthew Dithley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Ethan Zwick, Peter Nybratton, Gabriel K, AG Barcelona, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs No Hamsters, Brendan Crave, B, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, Adam H, B, Rambo, Larson 8669, Ivan Julien, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamond Steen, Michael O'Connor, Nicholas Butter, JD, James Kopinski, Jav, James Cully, Ethan Fitzmadrid, Ed Coulthard, D. San, Mike Barone, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, DZA, Giorgio Arani, Vegan Straight Edge Global Cabal, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Michael Neck, Freya Northman, Neba, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Bike Lane Bowser, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, JL, Stephen Davila, Chad Walker, What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Maurice Zumbul. Thank you all very much. Support us at patreon.com/popularfront.